involved. Everybody was.
Record.
So this week, the lessons appointed are for the Sunday, which is known proper 7, which off the top of my head, I think we're the 5th Sunday after Pentecost, 5th or 4th Sunday. But as I said, the lectionary is not divided in terms of Pentecost or Trinity as reference. The lectionary we're using uses the ordinals in terms of proper Sundays. So, and the way that works, I don't think I ever explained this, is actually it's a calendar thing that each Sunday is assigned a week, and there are dates to the week. And so, for example, if you look up proper 7, it says the Sunday between June 19th and June 25th inclusive, which means if the Sunday falls on any day from June 19th until June 25th, it is the proper 7. So that's how the lectionary actually is divided up. And so today, the lesson is the principal lesson we'll focus on is from Mark's Gospel, which is the 4th chapter beginning at the 35th verse, which is, again, I think the stories in Mark are quite familiar to most of us, which is why it's always an interesting gospel to study, because we've been living with these stories for quite some time. So let me bring that up on the screen share and we'll look at it quickly.
You may need to go into the lectionary to get it. When I clicked on it on the website, it told me the page didn't exist.
Oh, well, that's maybe just a bad link. So
Yeah.
it's the lectionary page, which is where I share it from anyway. So
Okay.
what you're looking at now, well, that's weird. I have a very strange looking screen on my my main computer. Anyway, okay, there we go. Which is let's go to the gospel. Oops.
Oh.
Because again, we're in that cycle where what we have is the Gospel of Mark, and then we have the other cyclical readings. We're in that cycle where the first reading, the lesson from the Old Testament, does not necessarily correlate with the gospel lesson, which it does in the track A. So we're in track B this year, as I've mentioned before, and so let's look at the gospel lesson. When evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. Now a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" There. So we have this lesson, which is situated immediately after what we studied last week, which was the parable of the sower. So Jesus has been teaching the crowds, and it seems that Jesus needs a break. So he's going to go for a boat ride, apparently. And they get in the boat, and there are just some interesting little factoids in this particular lesson, details that we might want to look at to help us ferret out some meaning for ourselves. That's the first, that basically he's been teaching, and he's been teaching by parables, and there have been crowds. This is not just simply his closest associates. He's not just simply talking to his closest friends. He's talking to large numbers of people. And so, well, relatively speaking, it's not a Cecil B. DeMille crowd, which normally, when we watch these movies, there's these thousands of people. And without the kind of audio supplanting and supplementing that we have in our current day, that would be extraordinarily difficult. So a large crowd in this context could be 50, 100, 150 people. Again, remember, this is Palestine. So it's also not New York City or Rome or any of the big urban areas that we're accustomed to, or even that the ancient world would be accustomed to. So the description, the vague descriptions of a large crowd, a small crowd, a crowd at all, is needs to be put in the context of the day. So when Jesus is teaching, the gospel writers will often make a distinction between whether he's talking to a crowd or his closest associates, his disciples. And that's simply the distinction that we need to make, and no more than that. And what the gospel writers are doing is saying that when he's speaking to the crowd, it's for general consumption, as it were, as opposed to his private instruction to those who are his closest associates, his colleagues, his co-workers, we might call them. And so there's this sort of dichotomy between the nature of Jesus' teaching and what Jesus is actually saying. So that when he's teaching in parables, he's more often than not teaching to the crowd. And then he pulls his disciples aside and gives them a little private instruction about what he's trying to get across. So that seems to be the pattern that we see growing here in Mark. So Jesus is tired of teaching, so he's going to go into a boat. He goes into the boat. Now, we have to remember, these are veteran fishermen. So these are not novices, guiding this little vessel on the open lake. But that's what it is. It might be called the Sea of Galilee, but, or something like that. But it's essentially just an overgrown lake. And lakes tend to be very shallow. Now, I grew up in the Great Lakes area, growing up in Western New York, and where we were situated, as a matter of fact, we had two Great Lakes within an easy driving distance. One was Lake Ontario, and one was Lake Erie, and they are very different. For example, Lake Ontario never freezes in the wintertime. Lake Erie in a cold winter will freeze all the way across, so that you have practically an ice bridge from the United States over to Canada. Lake Ontario is very cold. Lake Erie's waters can get fairly warm, relatively speaking. And the reason for that is just simply the reality of what the lakes really are. Lake Ontario is very deep. So it has upwelling of very, very cold water. So that's why during the summertime, when we used to go swimming at Hamlin Beach State Park, sometimes the water would, even in the middle of the summer, would be quite cold. But Lake Ontario, on the other hand, sometimes has algae blooms because I'm sorry, Lake Erie, on the other hand, can have algae blooms because it is warmer. And the reason it's warmer, it's very shallow. So in that sense, Lake Erie is a bit more like the Sea of Galilee. But one of the things that happens on Lake Erie that doesn't happen as frequently on Lake Ontario is the impact of a surface storm. That the surface storm can create great havoc on Lake Erie because it is shallow. It's like just a big bathtub. And for example, you can stir up the waters in the bathtub very easily. You can, make them jump up and down and do all that sort of thing. But if you get into a much larger body of water, that's not as easy. In point of fact, some of the more, lake sort of lore, sometimes the depth of the lake at the Buffalo end, which is the east end of the lake, can suddenly get deeper than the normal, the norm or the average depth at the west end. Why is that? Because we live in an area of westerly winds. And so if you have constant strong winds coming from west to east, it literally pushes the water to one end of the lake. Now that doesn't happen as frequently in Lake Ontario, again, because it's much deeper. So what I'm trying to get across here is this idea, trying to give you a sense of what this storm would be like. If the storm on Lake Ontario is causing that much disruption on the surface of the lake, you do not go out in a boat because it's been there for a while and really causing havoc. Lake Erie, you can go out and it can be perfectly calm. And then suddenly a surface storm, a thunderstorm or something will rise and come up. And if it has any strong winds at all, it can cause havoc on the lake. And so what we see here is the text says, they said, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. And so you have this little entourage going out into the lake or into the sea. And then it says, a great windstorm arose. A great windstorm. The Greek that is used there is megale. We use the word mega when we want to describe something really big. So Mark is saying this was a really big storm. And these things in a shallow body of water can come along, and what seemed to be a perfectly normal day to go out fishing or but they didn't do pleasure rides in those days, but they would go out into the lake or into the sea, and they'd be out there, and then suddenly, boom, the storm would come up, and they were a distance from shore, and it can cause great fear. I used to have a sailboat on Lake Erie, and and all of this is because of this. I've been in that situation, and it is frightful. It is frightful. And so these are veteran fishermen. They know the water, the scheme of everything. They know how to negotiate a boat and everything. And this is such a great storm that they are afraid. So this is some storm. So we just want to paint the picture here of what's going on. And then they have Jesus with them. And what is he? He's asleep in the stern. Now, if you know boat terminology, it's the back end of the boat. And that's usually the part that doesn't get swamped. What usually gets swamped is the bow, the front part of the boat, because it needs to cut through the waves. So the water is coming over the top of the boat. And that's how big the waves are relative to the size of the boat. And it's starting to fill with water. And so they're thinking, we're going to go down. And we're not just a few feet offshore so we can swim home. They're out. And so they wake Jesus up and they say, don't you care that this is all going on? And I don't know what they expected him to do, quite frankly. Maybe it was just because he was sleeping. And if you know that this kind of thing is happening, it's quote unquote all hands on deck, and everybody get a bucket or whatever, or whatever thing you can scoop water with and throw it overboard so that we don't sink. And there's an able-bodied young man sitting in the back, and he's supposed to be their leader, and he's fast asleep. So they're going, "Don't you care?" And he looks at them and says, "Oh, don't you have any faith?" And then he turns to the storm and he says, "Be still." And then the interesting thing about the text is there was a dead calm. In other words, this horrible storm that's been churning up all of this water and it's swamping the boat, it turns into glass. So it's that comparison that's an important point for us here. Another piece that we often don't think about is the cultural sort of realities of this day and age. This is an ancient people who, if you were, say, a Roman, you think that it's the gods who are in charge of all this stuff. It's, we think of it in terms of just, oh, wind is coming, weather front is going through, whatever, just the way I described the difference between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and all of that. And what's happening is they don't think that way. What they think of is that this is supernatural forces are behind all of these things. That's what governs storms. It governs thunder and lightning. Every ancient people has a god of thunder and a god of lightning, and so, and all of that comes together in one of these big rainstorms, these thunderstorms. We have too much science behind us so that we don't think in those terms. So understanding really what's going on inside the minds of the disciples at this point in time, we might not get there because we don't think about it in terms of these minor deities, running the things of nature. But Jesus gets up and he essentially casts out a demon. Because if we think of demons as these supernatural or preternatural forces that have impact on humans, this, in a maleficent way, a nasty way, those are demons. In good ways, they're angels. So Jesus is essentially casting out a demon here. He is taking control over what ancient peoples would think of as the realm of the gods. Now, as a Jewish person, you don't think of false gods or minor gods, these little preternatural beings or demiurges or whatever. You're thinking that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob is the one who runs it all. And so Jesus gets up from his little nap and he says, "Peace, be still." And there is a dead calm. And so suddenly they ask the question, well, just who is this person? Because now, it's not the little things that Jesus did, like healings, which other people did, casting out an evil spirit from a person, while other people did that too. Suddenly he has the power of the gods, or of Yahweh God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the creator of the universe. He's exercising that power. So there's a sudden question that comes to them, like, just who is this God? So this manifestation of Jesus in terms of his power as the Son of God comes into the story at this point. He's not just good teacher. He's not just rabbi. he's taking on a different qualitative sense among the disciples, because now they're questioning themselves. Who is he?
I'm
So
wondering
go ahead, George.
if he really was asleep
Hmm.
and that he may have been laying back there with his eyes closed and wondering if they are going to assume that their lives were not in danger because he was there and the Son of God wouldn't be allowed to drown. And uh, he waits and waits, and they come to him and shake him and whatnot, and he gives them this lecture about have you no faith, but uh, they thought they were really going to drown, and yet he seems to have felt that they should have known that they weren't going to drown. But that's a pretty tough test when the boat is filling with water.
Well,
So,
yeah.
there's this sort of thing that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, that he actually would be asleep. And would they have, when they were all floundering around in the water, would he wake up then and do something about it? He'd have to pull the boat back up. So I don't know, there's a little something that here um, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, unless he really knew when he was sleeping that he knew still what was going on.
Well, that's an insight, but I would also ask you a question. Don't forget, you're thinking about it from the point of view of you already know who he is. In Mark's narrative, they're just discovering who he is. Judith.
I wanted to speak about the imagery. And when you think about whatever disciples he is with, if it's the inner three, well, they're definitely sailors. They know what's going on. We don't know how many other disciples are in the boat. We don't know how big the boat is, but it must have been sizable to be fishing the kind of boats that they would fish in. And when I think of the violence of the storm, they would have already tried to cope. They would have taken the sails down so that they wouldn't be ripped away. It also meant then they were directionless. They couldn't control the ship. Between the waves and the wind, they weren't going to steer it anywhere. And then all of a sudden, there's nothing. It's like they're in the doldrums. It's absolutely, they're not going anywhere at that particular moment either.
Correct.
But what has been so fearful has been replaced with the awe of what Jesus just did. The imagery, I think, is really wonderful in that very short passage.
Judith, have you ever been in a sailboat when it's in irons?
I have avoided boats as much as possible. I don't like, now I have been on some cruises occasionally because I like to be on or near water because it's the most relaxing thing I can possibly think of. And you know what they say about our Susquehanna? Don't worry about falling overboard, just stand up and walk across.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's shallow except when it floods. So no, I don't know what you're referring to there.
What I'm referring to is when you're heading directly, if you can be in a very strong wind, and if you get into trouble, you try to, and it's hard to get out of, but you head directly into the wind, and the sail flaps like crazy, but you're it gets you out of trouble.
Oh, okay.
In a
Because
large,
I know
because
you
if you're
with wind,
but
you went straight into it.
Yeah, you head straight into it. it lessens the effect of the wind and the waves and everything. It's normally something you don't want to do. I have gotten yelled at a few times for getting us in irons when we were in our sailboat.
Oh. But obviously, guys
Yeah,
have done.
Bernie isn't very patient with me in the sailboat. And he accuses me of just wanting to clamshell the boat and get as much wind in the sails as I can, get it as level as I can, and not heading in any direction, just following the wind and goofing off. And
I was in a sailboat one time. I was on tour with a show, and one of our cast members knew Rex Harrison's son.
wow,
Harrison, and we were in Ogunquit, and he was crewing for a guy who had, no wait, a 40-foot racing sloop that was built in the 1930s.
Oh wow.
He arranged for the cast and crew of our show to go out, and he took all the married members of the cast went one day, all the rest of the single ones went the next day, and then anybody else who couldn't go those times, he took out a third day. And because I was crew, I was wardrobe, I went on the third trip. And that's the only time I ever saw people turn green. I didn't think it was possible. But I saw green faces, and he had to drop anchor and take a little dinghy and take those two people to shore because they were so sick.
Well, a racing sloop is not something that goes real level.
It's not a stable ship or boat.
No,
at
when
all.
we were
That's what I was told it was. Whether it was or not, I don't know.
It probably was from Algonquin, and given that the social class you're talking about, that's what they do in that area.
Yeah.
And he said he was crewing it. Now, he was the only one that day. His friend that owned the boat wasn't on board because he was going to take his wife on an anniversary cruise or something. And so he was getting familiar with that particular boat.
Yeah. Well, my brother-in-law's taken his boats to the Bahamas and Bermuda. And when we were in St. Martin once, I don't know if you've followed sailing at all, but in the 1980s, there was a gentleman by the name of Dennis O'Connor. It was America's Cup. He lost it one year, and then the next year he got it back with a new hull design and a new rudder and a new ballast design. But I'm trying to remember the exact term of the thing. But in St. Martin, they had these boats and you raced them.
Oh.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, you were leaning, you were
a lot like Winslow Homer's paintings with the boat.
Yeah. But you know what?
Go ahead.
But it could be scary at times, but it was so much fun.
Yeah. Well, it's risk, and that's part of it.
Yeah, and Bernie was never contented when we were sailing if I wasn't riding up on the side of the boat and I didn't get my rear end wet.
Yeah, well, that's between you and Bernie.
Well, yeah, you know Bernie though, don't you?
Yeah. But there's something about this story too. Even with what we're talking about here, it's an interesting thing to realize that this parallels another story. Think about the story of Jonah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jonah tries, he's running away. First of all, he's running away from God. He gets himself hired onto this, or not hired, but he hires the ship. He gets to be a passenger on one of these merchant ships that ply the Mediterranean. And as part of the story, he is now they run into a big storm. And again, these are pagan folk. And so again, they're the believers in, that these demiurge gods take care of the waters and the winds and all that stuff. And suddenly when the storm comes up, they think that the gods are displeased. So they're going like, well, what's the only thing that's different this time? We got that guy on the ship.
Jonah.
And so he's been talking to them about why he's on their ship in the first place. So it's interesting, the text, it's in the first chapter, they go wake him up.
Oh, I didn't remember
And
that.
they implore him to pray to his God to see if his God will intercede and stop this nonsense. And when nothing happens, that's when they throw him overboard.
And these men would have known that story.
Absolutely.
They weren't about to throw Jesus overboard. However, when he wakes and says, "Why are you afraid?" It was like, duh, can't you tell what's going on here? Of course we're afraid.
Well, that leads us then to the next level for meaning for us. That's the core question in this passage. Why are you afraid? Have you no faith? So that Mark is using this as a way of asking his readers why they would have any fear about being Jesus' disciples. Fear is an overriding theme through Mark's gospel. In fact, at the very end of Mark's gospel, again, this is the gospel that does not formally have a resurrection appearance of Jesus. All we hear about is the empty tomb. And even in that context, the women who discover it are afraid. And even in the other gospels where we see Jesus appearing, what is his first caution? Fear not. Or the angels, rather. The angels say that. Do not be afraid. He has gone ahead of you. So there is this idea, because again, remember the context of the early church. These are disciples that are starting to undergo persecution, first from their Jewish compatriots, because they're following this peripatetic heretical rabbi called Jesus, that all the authorities are saying is a bad person and do not do this. And you risk being shunned by the synagogue community should you continue to follow him. And then beyond that, the early church is undergoing the formal persecutions that we know so much more about relative to the Roman Empire. So there is plenty of reason for fear. And why would we be afraid of the wind and the storms? Because those are things that we cannot control. But God can. So suddenly we begin to reflect on this idea of fear. What causes us fear externally? And do we necessarily need to be afraid if we have this ultimate confidence and trust in God, which we call faith? So suddenly this isn't a story about a few fishermen in a boat with a storm on a shallow lake. This becomes a story about disciples who, not quite sure still of their relationship to this Jesus person, who might be very much afraid because of circumstances that are well beyond their control. And that the antidote to that fear is faith. Confident trust in God. Just like one would trust God to calm the storm. And sometimes, actually, I would say this, that the storm is not necessarily calmed around us, as it is in this story, But the power of God's Spirit is really within us, so that the calm can come from within. In Buddhist meditation practice, for example, one of the key concepts is equanimity. And equanimity teaches that you can't control your surroundings and everything. And you can't, but you can control your response to things. So equanimity is not an attitude of, I don't care, or it doesn't matter. What it is a balancing of our emotions. So that if we find ourselves growing in fear, that's a sign to us that we need to go to that place where we can find the calm. That's sort of the Zen practice thing. But in what we're being taught here is that the place to find that is in your trust in God. Trust God. And it will come out right. Hildegard of Bingen, the English mystic from Norwich in England, has a phrase that's often quoted: all will be well, all things will be well. And that sounds so Pollyannish and, sort of idealistic and all that kind of thing. But this is precisely what she's speaking of here, is that the antidote to the fear that we find in ourselves is in our refuge in God. And going to God, whether it's in prayer, whether it's by seeking God in community, by seeking out others of like mind and heart, where we, again, together we are stronger than we are apart kind of philosophy. And all of that works together in the Christian's life. So that when we fear, a thought just came to mind, for example, in my ministry with the dying, that often most people find death a fearsome thing to confront. And yet the greatest comfort, I think, that I've been able to give anyone is not some sort of scripture verse or anything like that. It's to be with them and to hold their hand. Because there's a strength in that where they know they are not alone. And see, the question of the disciples to Jesus is, don't you care about us? And so when we are afraid, what we want to know is that someone that we trust and someone who is still powerful enough, and, when we're facing death, particularly from illness and so on, the person who is well is the one who is strong enough, reaches to us and takes our hand. Remember the story, the same kind of story, but in Matthew's gospel, where Peter doubts that it's Jesus. And so he said, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you. And he says, yes, come. And he gets out of the boat and he starts walking on the water. And then suddenly he falls in. Well, what Jesus does is reach out and grab his hand, grab his arm. So that's also a message for us in terms of where we can find the strength and the source of this power to calm the storm can be in one another, as well as in our innate trust in God, because that's the first step. And as believers, as disciples of Christ, we believe that Christ dwells in each and every one of us. So if we're searching for Christ, where do we turn? We don't turn to some, phantasm. we turn to one another because we bear the image of Christ in one another. And so consequently, the church, capital C church, in other words, the assembly of believers, we're not talking denominations here. The church becomes the place where we go. And it's no mistake that in the iconography of the church, in the old Gothic style, the church is called what?
Basilica?
No, in the main part of the church.
Oh, it's a nave, which
A nave.
refers to the sea, navy.
Because it's an upside down ship, the way that the rib ceiling and all that.
The ceilings, yeah.
Again, these images are all around us to remind us.
We're all in the same boat.
There you go. To use a modern phrase. Yeah. So that the assembly that gathers there is the place. We are all in the same boat, quite literally. And so we turn to the Christ figure and we say, don't you care? When the Operation Desert Storm was initiated, I was the acting rector or the dean at the Catholic Cathedral in Buffalo. And something told it was, because it was nighttime. And the first call for us, what I'm saying, I don't know if I got my terminology correct, but and I went over to the church, turned more than just the nightlights on. I put the processional cross in the middle of the sanctuary and just opened the doors. There were people who actually came. They were looking for a place to go to pray, because this is the first time we had been at war, and no one knew what the outcome was. That was the awe and shock and awe kind of thing. We didn't really know how that was going to turn out, and so there was great uncertainty and there was fear. And it was about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but it was wintertime, so it was dark. People actually came to the church to pray, and it was impressive to me. I mean, it wasn't droves, maybe a dozen at most in this church that holds like 1,000 people, but they needed a place to go to feel safe and not alone. And these were not our parishioners, because the cathedral's parishioners were just a disparate bunch. They were spread all over the place. And the ones that were living nearby were mostly senior citizens in a HUD housing project, and they were not going to venture out, in the dark downtown Buffalo. So these were people who drove there or, arrived there from their offices or whatever, and just needed that sense of it'll be okay. I mean, that was just a very brief moment and an experience that sort of talks about this idea of fear, and that we turn to God in our fear to find solace and comfort. But Jesus says, why are you bothering me? I was napping. I was having a nice dream. And you woke me up. Don't you have your own faith? Don't you have your own trust in God? Why do you need me? So this short little passage of 6 verses, and 6 verses in Mark is like very short, because Mark's verses are very brief. Talks about a lot of things.
May I ask about one little teeny tiny thing that probably doesn't have anything to do with anything, but Mark sticks the darndest things in, like I said last time about the mustard seed and whatever we were doing, and then Jesus explained in private to the disciples. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat comma, just as he was. Okay, he didn't pack any bags.
Mhm.
He wasn't going on a major excursion where he needed to take stuff with him. But I wonder that that little teeny phrase is tacked on there.
Well, what does it mean to you?
That he just picked up and went. That he didn't take, well, yeah, when he sent disciples out, he said, don't take extra things with you, just go. So I guess he just went. But it just seems an odd add-on to the end of that sentence.
What was
Well,
it?
it also kind of points to the point that Jesus' power is all in himself. He doesn't have any special talisman. He doesn't have any sacrifice to the gods. He doesn't, all that kind of
Okay,
stuff.
so it was setting us up. And what Mark is writing is setting us up then for the storm. Okay. But it mentions that other boats were with him.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're not mentioned anywhere else, but they would have been on the sea at the same time and experiencing the same thing. But to them, the calming of the storm would have been a mystery.
Possibly. But if
Unless
Jesus
they're
heads up in the boat and they've been following because they want to follow him, they're going to notice that he's doing something.
Well, again, he's berating them for something they didn't do. And I have to imagine rewriting this story where they do the right thing. Peter says, calm down. God won't let this happen. Not with his son sitting over there asleep. Calm yourselves, calm yourselves. And the seas calm down. Jesus awakes and says, you did the right thing.
That would be a good story, but it's not the way it happened. Because they don't really.
So the story wouldn't be worth much, but it would be, it was so he's trying to say that's what he expected of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to say they really probably didn't know who Jesus was at this time. Right. They knew he was someone very special.
Well, they had doubts.
Yeah.
Remember, this is Mark's gospel, and all through Mark's gospel, it's like, oh, they didn't understand. These dumb disciples. From our perspective, is going, why can't you see this? It's right in front of you. But that's exactly the point. Because in reality, that's our experience, is it not? I mean, we talk about this Jesus person as if everybody just, they understand what's going on. But most of the world does not. It requires this step of faith. And once you have it, it's hard not to see it this way because it changes your vision of the world. It changes your, philosophers would say it changes your cosmology. It changes the way you see how the world is put together and how it operates. Regardless of the culture or the scientific era in which you're living, it's just this notion of faith changes your perspective on many, many, many things. And so we can be as dull as those early disciples in some things as well. I'm doing a study on the spiritual gifts, trying to sort of retool my understanding of things. And it is compelling how we, in our more skeptical age, have essentially neutered, we've talked about this in a different context before, neutered the power of the Spirit by saying that stuff doesn't really matter. Healings, casting out of demons, I mean, because those are ancient images, but the gifts are still the same. Maybe they're exercised in a different way, but we're blind to see that they're actually gifts from God's Spirit. When somebody says or does something that moves us deeply, do we think, oh, that was a spirit of prophecy at work? No. that person's really smart, or they really get me, or they have something, we have some, phrases that we use like that. But we don't see this as the work of God's Spirit. And so very often we neglect in the same way the elements of faith as these first disciples did. And we can be as clueless as they. I love the phrases sometimes in our Eucharistic prayers because they're so scripturally based, but they also draw conclusions for us in terms of the way that the prayer goes. Prayer C that we use during Eastertide a lot at St. Luke's kind of does this when it says, I don't know, the phrase is in my head now, I can't think of it, but it talks about, to open our eyes that we may see your hand at work in creation, in the world about us. Open our eyes that we might see your hand in the work, in the world around us. God is at work all the time, but we fail to see that it is God's hand at work. That's the element of faith. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's what happens when we talk about this change in cosmological viewpoint, is that we just change the way we see things. And sometimes those that are closest to us, even the people that love us the most, kind of look at us like, remember the phrase a couple weeks ago that Jesus was beside himself?
Mhm.
And that his mother and brothers came to take him away because they thought he was crazy? There can be times when people think we're pretty nutso, because we have this blind, in their viewpoint, blind confidence in God. To quote, for us to look for that equanimity in our life, and we would quote Hildegard, "It will be well, all things will be well." They go like, "You're nuts." But that's the confidence that the Spirit can give us with the gift of faith. When we talk about the spiritual gifts, the gift of faith, which is the core element here relative to the antidote to fear, is not simply believing. It's not intellectual assent to a set of beliefs and doctrines and all that sort of thing. When we talk about the gift of faith, it is this gift of what we call supernatural faith, which means that essentially we've had that change in viewpoint. And we see God at work in the world around us, or the world about us. That's nutso to the world that we know. And then, of course, people think, well, if God's in charge of everything, how come there's evil? There's a great meme, actually, that I saw on Facebook, of all places, which quoted Einstein. There's an anecdote. I don't know if it's apocryphal or true, but George would appreciate this as a scientist, and Kathy as an engineer. And he goes through and he says, there's this, I guess he's a teen at the time, and he's in class. And one of his professors says, if there is a God, why is there evil? And Einstein stands up and he says, apparently, that's the wrong question to ask. He says, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, when is there, does cold exist? And the professor says, well, of course it does, and he talks about, feeling cold. He says, no, cold is merely the absence of heat and the interaction of matter. And he goes on to this little explanation, and, and then there's the conclusion of it is the conclusion of absolute zero, which what is it? 427.
467.7 Rankine.
There you go.
Minus 273 Celsius.
Which is 0 Kelvin. Kelvin is the absolute, where there is no interaction in matter at absolute zero. There is no energy being expended. It is the absolute lack of energy. It's a theoretical point. It can't actually exist per se, because then matter doesn't exist. So then, and okay, well, we move on to the next thing. Well, what is dark? Does darkness exist? And they have this dialogue, essentially the same thing, that Einstein concludes, no, darkness is simply the absence of light. And, how do we measure how dark a place is? By how much light is not there. That's how we actually measure it. It's true. It's there is no positive measure for darkness. And then he goes on, and then he says, the same is true of evil, that evil is the absence of God. God did not create evil. Evil is simply that state of being where God is absent. Well, of course, God is never absent. And so is there anything that can be like, there can't be absolute zero? Can there be absolute complete evil? And the answer to that is no, because it doesn't exist as a separate entity. It's a negative reality. And that's an interesting thing, because one of the ways in which John Paul II, as Pope, when queried, I forgot exactly what the context of it was, but he was queried as to what is hell. And he said, I don't believe, and you have to understand that John Paul, as Karol Wojtyła, was a philosopher, not a theologian. That was what his background was. And he said, hell is not a place. Hell is being totally separate and eternally separated from God. And, when you think about it, and basically it's saying it's total annihilation. That what was being no longer exists, because nothing can be except in God. So that when we talk about the punishment of hell, it's a descent into nothingness. So again, that's the concept, of fear. Is doubt a lack of faith? No. Doubt is a question. Faith is always there in the human spirit. But to have a gift of supernatural faith, which changes your perspective on everything, that's the gift of the Spirit. And that's the thing Jesus is talking about here.
May I make a comment about a different reading? When you put the readings up for today, it looked like the first reading was from Samuel, but on my calendar that I have here, it says the first reading is from Job.
Job, correct.
So I went.
Two different tracks. Again, remember, there's two different tracks.
So I went to Job, and I like the fact that it is connected to the seas. Because God's talking to Job and says, I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?
Right.
Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements? And he goes on about making the limits of the sea, the clouds to create the rain and everything. So, reading that and then going to the gospel lesson, you do see a connection between the readings and the fact that God's in control.
Right.
Isn't.
Well, all we need to go is to the Psalms. The Psalms say it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Who made the heavens, and, all of this, because this is something that propels the human imagination into cosmic awareness. It really does. So that's what faith, this notion of supernatural faith we're talking about, is a gift of the Spirit. That's what that does. It compels us, or impels us, propels us, if you will, into this cosmic awareness. And so when Jesus says, have you no faith? You know, aren't you aware that God is in control of all of this? And whatever happens to you for good or ill will be in God's hands? And how often we ourselves would see a threat to life, per se, and like in this instance, as evil. Has there ever been a chance where someone passes from this world, but they are spared immense suffering because of it? How often someone dies of heart failure while they're suffering with great and painful cancers? And what's our immediate response? Well, they were spared
Right.
all that suffering. So all of a sudden, death became a good thing. The debate over what is unfortunately called mercy killing or euthanasia, you know, and the moral question, the ethical debate about whether do we, you know, in terms, and George, you know, I know in your specialty, this wasn't exactly your ethical conundrum most of the time, but, you know, whether someone should take every treatment possible, even if it's just to prolong their life 5 minutes, you know, or can we just simply allow someone to slip away? I don't know how many times that I've been confronted with that. Well, people will call and say, you know, our grandmother or our parent or my child is in this situation. Is it wrong for me to allow them to die? To withhold treatment that everyone tells me is really not going to improve their quality of life. They definitely are not going to be cured, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the big conundrum around brain death or people who are credited to be terminally ill, but on life support systems. How long do we keep them there?
This is why we have advance directives.
Mhm.
And it's very clearly laid out for you if you are making your advance directive that if there is no hope of recovery, I do not want any medication or treatment that will prolong my life. In other words, let me die.
Yeah.
And when you are at that stage, hospice is offered to you. And these are really wonderful people who come and they prepare the person for dying.
Mhm.
And so that it is a very good thing for us to think about that. And places like Cornwall Manor tell us we feel you should have an advance directive so that we know what to do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And when I mentioned that to the physician that was talking to me about Betty's situation, I said, and she has an advance directive that says nothing is to be done to prolong her life. And he said, fine, we will contact hospice and they will be up to see you.
Mhm. It is something, you know, where we have great power. And sometimes the question is we don't know how to wield it. And sometimes we forget again, that's the perspective of faith. What is the purpose of life? What is my relationship to God? What is my relationship to divinity? What is my relationship to one another, to my, to my, people I love and know me and so on. That all of that comes to the fore and is included in this cosmology of faith, if you will, because people of faith very often some people will take advanced directives from a point of view and they'll use them from the point of view of economic utility. It's just not worth it. But the point of view of whether, we start talking about quality of life, we start to talk about, what it does to those who are surviving and all that sort of thing, that's a very different cosmological perspective than, economic utility. Because and therein is the quandary when we start to get into social policy, can this same power to give or withhold also then be misused, by the people who wield that power? We had a very effective, very helpful series. We're going to run it again sometime in the not too distant future, in terms of things like advanced directives and so on. It was during Lent a couple of years ago, where we had the folks from WellSpan and Hershey Med and all those kinds of, and hospice. They're all there to help us, clarify all these different things that need to happen. And the fact that none of that guarantees anything, quite frankly, because survivors can always override it, particularly if they have power of attorney. And, so there's always that. So that this faith question needs to be more than just the individual's self-determination, which is what, advanced directives is rooted in our social concept of self-determination. Mm-hmm. But also it needs to be a communal decision from the point of view that everybody agrees. So in that sense, it's covenantal. Mm-hmm. That, and again, that's a faith perspective, that we enter into covenant with one another to respect one another's wishes on these things. Because I've seen it happen where you get the odd, person out of the siblings who just cannot bear letting go, and will try mightily to override, the advanced directives that were legitimately placed by the individual and that other siblings are trying to uphold. And it will then cause division in families. It will cause, there are a couple of families, even in our parish, I can tell you, where that was a dividing factor, and people have not spoken to each other since. Hmm. Because, you killed mother. It was that kind of thing. And unfortunately, because sometimes the church gets in this mess, in this mix-up of things. And while in this particular case, there was the person was an extremely pro-life person and said that there should be, and didn't understand really even they were Catholics, and not understood the Catholic Church's teaching on this, which is about artificially prolonging life and all that sort of thing. So, extraordinary measures, all of that was a lot of gobbledygook as far as they were concerned. As long as that person is breathing and the heart is beating, and, they didn't even want to talk about brain waves or anything, because they're using a very ancient concept of what life and death is. And, and then you have the extraordinary stories of the 1 in 100,000 case where someone was comatose for many, many years in a vegetative state and then emerged.
Yeah. Or eventually died anyway. I think about the singer from the 50s, Jackie Wilson. I don't know if you knew who he was.
Yes.
He had a heart attack on stage, fell, struck his head, and was in a coma. Died after 8 years in a coma from pneumonia. Mm-hmm. Now, that was back in the 60s. We know so much more now. that we can look at situations like that. But yeah, you can quote a case, 1 in a million cases. I agree, you should have directives, and everybody should be on the same page
Yeah.
as far as family is concerned.
I mean,
And
because
things can be screwy, because when my mother died and my father remarried, she had a directive and the hospital lost it
yes,
and came to me and said, "You're her daughter." I said, "No, I am not her daughter. Her son is career military and he's in Massachusetts." Well, what are we supposed to do? They had already resuscitated her 3 times.
wow,
I said, "She has a directive, do not resuscitate." And then I went to the phone and called him and he said, "You said the right thing, you did the right thing," because at least we could talk to each other.
yes,
That is so important, that people communicate.
yes,
Yes, but
No?
sometimes places ignore DNRs.
yes.
Oh,
That happened to my father-in-law.
oh,
Well, he died at the hospital anyway. They couldn't keep a heartbeat going, but
Well, and there's no bigger maelstrom, to use that term, which is a storm. Again, so, looking at the imagery of today's lesson, there is no bigger maelstrom than what surrounds the contexts that we're talking about here.
Mhm.
And so the question becomes, why are you so afraid? Why are you so confused?
mhm.
I'm here. Have faith. In other words, turn to me and you'll know what to do.
Mhm.
And this is, it's a little bit of what George said. If we could rewrite the story, they would know what to do. The problem is that we don't know what to do, and we never rewrite the story. We just keep repeating it over and over and over and over again. But thus it was. So with that in mind, we're reaching the end of our time together. So this has been an intriguing conversation. As we often do together, which is wonderful, because this is where we share safely what we're thinking and what we believe God is trying to communicate to us through these very short little snippets of Mark and other scriptures that we bring in. The story of Jonah we brought in today, and we know how it happened to Jonah. I love Jonah and all. I love all these guys, but this Jonah figure is particularly interesting to me, because he's the one who didn't want to do what God wanted him to do, and when he did what God wanted to do, and God did what God said would happen, he said, "No, it can't happen. It's not supposed to happen."
And he was ticked off with the result anyway.
What do you need me for? If they were going to repent, why did I have to go all this? Why did I have to go through that whale thing? Which teaches us basically don't resist the will of God. That's essentially the message of Jonah. Anyway, there we have it. So with that in mind, thank you for today.
Can I ask a quick question not related to Bible study?
Not related? Okay.
Not related.
Okay, then I'm going to end the recording for us all and bid those who might watch this thank you. We'll stop the recording.